Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome all those who join us on our heritage.org website on these occasions. Would ask everyone here in the house to make sure, thank you, Michaela, that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It's always a nice gesture. And, of course, our internet viewers are welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at any time to speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our event today is Michaela Dodge, Policy Analyst for Defense and Strategic Policy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. She specializes in missile defense, modernization of nuclear weapons, and arms control. She holds a Master's of Science degree in Defense and Strategic Studies from Missouri State University, where she was awarded the Ulrich Schumacher Memorial Scholarship for 2 years. She received a bachelor's degree in International Relations and Defense and Strategic Studies from Maastricht University, Czech Republic. She is a former National Security Fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a former Publius Fellow at the Claremont Institute. She also participates in the Project on Nuclear Issues, Nuclear Scholars Initiative of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Michaela. Michaela Dodge.
Thank you very much for coming. This will be a real treat for us. If you have not read the book, Time to Attack, please do so. It's a fantastic book. Dr. Kronig is joining us at Heritage. He's an associate professor in International Relations Field Chair in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's a senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council and the author of the book, A Time to Attack. From May 2010 to May 2011, he served as a special advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, where he worked on defense policy and strategy for Iran. And for his work, he was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Award for Outstanding Achievement. He has held fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations, Harvard University, the National Science Foundation, Stanford, and the University of California. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I will let Dr. Kronig make an opening remarks about his book, it's just, again, it's excellent book. It's very well written. It's very logical, despite its controversial title. And then I will ask Dr. Kronig 3 questions that I prepared, and then we will open the floor for the discussion. Dr. Kronig, thank you for joining us at Heritage. Please welcome Dr. Kronig.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Michaela. It's a pleasure to be back here at Heritage. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful spring day. I know you'd probably rather be outside, but I'm glad you decided to join me. We're here today to talk about my new book, Time to Attack, the Looming Iranian Nuclear Threat. As Michaela pointed out, the title is somewhat aggressive. So some people read the title, I think, and assume that I'm arguing that the military option is our best option. It should be our first option. But that's not the case. I argue that we should try to solve this problem, the Iranian nuclear challenge, diplomatically, if at all possible. But that's what everyone thinks, so that's not really even an interesting question. The interesting question is, what happens if diplomacy fails? If we're unable to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons through diplomacy, then what comes next? Are we prepared to live with a nuclear-armed Iran, to live with the threats posed by a nuclear-armed Iran for decades to come? And if not, are we prepared to take military action to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons? So the argument of the book is that we should try to solve the problem diplomatically, if at all possible, but that if negotiations fail to stop Iran, we should conduct a limited strike on Iran's key nuclear facilities to prevent Iran from building nuclear weapons. While there are many risks with that, it's less bad, in my view, than living with the threats posed by a nuclear-armed Iran for decades to come. Or to name the book, if diplomacy fails, there will come a time to attack. Now, this isn't, in my view, a controversial argument. I mean, of course, whenever you're talking about issues of war and peace, it's somewhat controversial. But this argument is essentially America's stated position on the Iranian nuclear issue. The Obama administration has said several times that a nuclear-armed Iran cannot be contained. that our policy is prevention, that the president is prepared to do, quote, everything required, end quote, including use force if necessary to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. So this, again, it's not a controversial argument. It's essentially America's approach. Now, there was a time when this argument was controversial. As Michaela pointed out, I worked as an advisor on Iran policy starting in 2010, 2011. So I was working precisely on this issue, and it was at that time that I first came to this conclusion, that if we get to this point, that the military option is a viable option and, in fact, superior to trying to deter and contain a nuclear-armed Iran. And then in 2012, I left government. I published an article in Foreign Affairs where I first made this argument publicly. And that was controversial. At the time, the U.S. government hadn't taken an explicit stand on this issue. There were many leading analysts like Fareed Zakaria who argued that we should simply deter and contain a nuclear-armed Iran. And so there were many people at the time, many of my colleagues, who responded in written response pieces and public debates criticizing the argument. But just a few weeks later, President Obama essentially came to my rescue and said that his policy was the same, that a nuclear-armed Iran, not only was containment not our policy, but a nuclear-armed Iran, quote, cannot be contained. So not only is it not our policy, but it can't be done, and that he was prepared to do whatever it took, include use military force. So I think what's happened over the past 2 years is the conventional kind of establishment view on this issue has done a near 180-degree turn. And it's shifted so much that now people who argue that deterrence and containment should be on the table are often ostracized as extremists. Rand Paul got himself in trouble a few weeks ago simply for suggesting that deterrence and containment should be an option and tried to backtrack. So essentially over the past couple of years, I think this establishment viewpoint has caught up to this position I've argued for going back to 2010 or so. Now, on the back of the book, I have an endorsement from Eric Edelman, and that endorsement means a lot to me because I hold Ambassador Edelman in the highest regard, but also for what he says. Ambassador Edelman says that this is, quote, the most thorough book-length examination of the issues involved in assessing the Iranian nuclear challenge. And that means a lot because that's essentially what I set out to do when I sat down to write this book. I'd been working on the Iranian nuclear problem almost all day, every day for 4 years. And I felt like I had a lot of information that I wanted to share, that I wasn't able to share it in some of the shorter opinion pieces that I'd written. And so I sat down here to do just that, to provide the most thorough book-length examination of the problem. So I think no matter what your interest is in the Iranian nuclear challenge, no matter what your ideological predisposition, no matter what your preferred policy outcome is, if you have a preferred policy outcome, you'll find it in this book. So the book does 3 things. It begins with the history of Iran's nuclear program, going all the way back to the 1950s and an Atoms for Peace deal with the United States. Goes through to the Iranian Revolution, to the first supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini's decision to build nuclear weapons in the late 1980s, and runs up through the election of President Rouhani and the interim deal. The next thing it does is go through all the major policy options. So I start out with what I call the non-starters, things that I don't see really as serious options, but that some people put forward. So I argue that we can't just cyber attack, sabotage, and assassinate our way out of this problem. I argue that waiting for regime change isn't going to work, that we're going to have to make tough decisions on the nuclear issue before any new government comes to power. I argue that the Japan model, the idea that we allow Iran to have an advanced nuclear capability like Japan so long as it doesn't build nuclear weapons, is also not a serious option. The Japan model will become the North Korea model very quickly. And then I get into the more serious policy options after dismissing those non-starters. So the longest chapter in the book is on diplomacy, on the history of diplomacy, on the various types of deals, on the advantages and disadvantages of those deals, on what our diplomatic strategy should be. If this current round of negotiations break down, what our diplomatic strategy plan B should be to get Iran back to the table. So again, I think this belies the notion that some people might have from the title that I give short shrift to diplomacy. It's actually the longest chapter in the book. But I think the most interesting part of the book is on this what is worse question. If diplomacy fails and we're faced with this difficult choice of either acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran or taking military action, what is worse? So I have an entire chapter on the military option, what are the various force packages, what are the risks of taking military action, what is the strategy the United States could put in place to deal with those risks. I have a chapter on deterrence and containment. What are the threats posed by a nuclear-armed Iran? What is the strategy we could put in place to deal with those threats? What are the limitations of that strategy? And then the penultimate chapter is a chapter called What is Worse, where I compare those options side by side. And the way that I do this is I identify America's most important national security objectives as I see them. The United States would like to defend the homeland, prevent nuclear proliferation, combat international terrorism, maintain the free flow of energy resources around the world, maintain regional stability in the Middle East, protect our allies, a number of other things. And so what I do is look at each of those interests and ask, how do these two options affect those interests? How does deterring and containing a nuclear-armed Iran affect that entire slate of interests? And how would taking military action affect those entire slate of interests? And when you go through this exercise, you see something that I think is pretty interesting. First, there are a number of interests for which military action is clearly preferable. Nuclear proliferation is one example, where taking military action better protects that interest than allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons. The second thing you see is that there are many interests that seem to be pure toss-ups. It's really hard to make a clear case that one is better than the other. So for example, maintaining regional stability in the Middle East, taking military action, of course, is bad for stability in the short run. Taking military action, Iranian military retaliation, a potential for a broader conflict. But over the long term, deterring and containing a nuclear-armed Iran is also bad for regional stability. Iran would likely be more aggressive. Other countries in the region would attempt to proliferate in response. We'd have nuclear crisis after nuclear crisis. And I think there's a good argument to be made that over the long term, acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran would be worse for regional stability. So a number of interests that it's kind of hard to make a clear argument. What's interesting, though, is that there's not a single U.S. national security interest that's clearly better protected in both the short and the long run by simply allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons. So I think that when the president makes these statements that Iran's unacceptable, we'll do what it takes, and when people like me make these statements that we should use force if necessary, that people think it's, maybe it's just bluster or political posturing. But I think it's not the case at all. It's based on sound analysis, and it's the analysis and rationale I try to provide in this book. And I think more broadly, the United States, U.S. officials often say that the spread of nuclear weapons poses one of the greatest threats to international peace and security, poses one of the greatest threats to U.S. national security interests. So if that's the case, then we must be willing to do what it takes to stop the spread of the world's most dangerous weapons. And counterproliferation strikes against nuclear facilities have to be one of many tools in our toolkit to do that. So I think if you look, the taking tough action to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons is really consistent with America's approach to foreign policy over the past century or so. The United States, as the most powerful country on earth, has often taken tough action to provide for international peace and security that's provided stability and prosperity for the rest of the globe. And now is not the time to shirk our responsibility. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess we'll have to switch by the podium.
Okay.
All right, first question. So if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, let's say that we do not act, we do not do anything, deal is not successful, how will it use its nuclear weapon? And part of it is actual use. What would be objectives that Iran would obtain by actually using nuclear weapons militarily? But part of that question is if Iran just has nuclear weapons and uses the political influence to coerce or blackmail allies.
Should I come back up?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question, and I think to answer that question, you have to start with Iran's strategic objectives. What does Iran want to achieve in the world? And Iran's leaders are very clear about this. They say that their primary objective is to protect the current theocratic regime, but that in addition, their goals are to be able to deter foreign attack, to be able to deter Israel, deter the United States from conducting an attack against Iran, and Iran's leaders explicitly say that their goal is to become the most dominant state in the Middle East. So some people argue, well, if Iran got nuclear weapons, maybe they would actually be more peaceful. They would feel secure, and so they could pull back. But that's not consistent with what Iran's leaders say. Iran's leaders explicitly say they want to become the most dominant state in the Middle East. So if they acquired nuclear weapons, I think they would use nuclear weapons as a way to achieve those goals. So right now, we know that Iran's leaders restrain their foreign policy because they fear major U.S. military retaliation if they go too far, in terms of supporting terrorists, for example. But if they had nuclear weapons, they know that they could deter a major U.S. military attack through the threat of nuclear retaliation. So I think nuclear weapons would provide a shield under which Iran could become more aggressive in its foreign policy in the region, stepping up support to terrorist and proxy groups, engaging in more coercive diplomacy in the region, engaging in nuclear threats and nuclear crises with other states. And so in that kind of situation, there's a real risk of nuclear war. And I don't think that Iran's leaders are suicidal. Some people might, I don't. I don't think that Iran's supreme leader will ever wake up and say today's a good day for a nuclear exchange. But it's inevitable that Iran's leaders will, or that Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran, would get into crises with other states, with a nuclear-armed Israel, with a nuclear-armed United States, in the future, potentially other nuclear-armed states in the region. And in those kind of high-stakes crises, there's a real risk of things spinning out of control and resulting in a nuclear exchange. So a nuclear attack against Israel could very well mean the end of the state of Israel. I don't think Israel's leaders are exaggerating when they say it's an existential threat. I think that's right. And the U.S. Department of Defense estimates that Iran could have ballistic missiles capable of reaching the east coast of the United States by next year, by 2015. So a high-stakes crisis with Iran could result on a nuclear attack against the U.S. homeland. So these are very real risks, and I think that's part of the reason that many people have looked at this and came to the same conclusion. You know, President Bush and President Obama didn't agree on a lot when it comes to foreign policy, but they both said that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, and I think that's correct.
Now, we're in the middle of Protect America Month here at Heritage Foundation, which is a month where we draw attention to defense issues. As we are withdrawing from Afghanistan, and if sequestration remains the law of the land and our capabilities deteriorate in the next 5 to 10 years, how do you think Iran will view U.S. posture in the region?
Well, I think there are a number of developments over the past few years that have really hurt America's credibility on this issue and more broadly. So some of the issues that you point to, but also the debacle over the Syrian red line on chemical weapons. And so I think we're in a bad situation where my own view is that when the president says he's willing to take action if necessary, I believe him in that. I've talked to a number of his top advisors who insist that the president says the same thing behind closed doors that he says in public. That, yes, he wasn't willing to act in Syria, but Iran's different. That the president believes that the spread of nuclear weapons, worldwide nuclear reductions is a key part of his foreign policy legacy, and he understands that a nuclear arms race in the Middle East is deeply antithetical to that vision, so he is willing to use force. So I believe him in that, many other people don't, and so that's part of the problem. If the president is serious, but nobody else believes him, that's the worst possible situation. I think many people in the city don't believe him, many people in the country don't believe him, and I think the Iranians and the Israelis don't believe him. So that sets us up for a war that could potentially be avoided. If we have credibility on this issue, and the supreme leader actually believes it, then we could deter him from crossing our red lines. If Iran's supreme leader thinks that the president's bluffing, then there's no reason for him not to push forward with his nuclear program, and then if the president's serious, we'd get into a conflict we could have avoided. So one of the things I do in the book is talk about things that we could do to increase our credibility on this issue. So I say that if this current round of negotiations fails, that there are 3 steps that the country should take. First, I think the administration should set clear red lines for Iran's nuclear program, set out the red lines that would trigger immediate military retaliation. Second, I think the administration could engage in more aggressive outreach, diplomatic outreach to our partners and allies overseas, talk to the Brits, talk to NATO allies about this problem, make it clear that we're taking the necessary diplomatic steps to take military action if necessary. And then third and finally, I think there's something that Congress could do, and I know that many of you are probably here from Congress. I think there are actually a couple of things Congress could do. First, I think if this round of negotiations break down, there's no reason why Congress shouldn't immediately pass the toughest remaining sanctions against Iran's banking and oil sector to tighten the economic noose even more. And then second, I think Congress should pass an authorization for the use of military force for Iran. Any U.S. president would prefer to have the support of Congress rather than not, and so I think making it clear that Congress would support military action on Iran, even though it wasn't, or at least wasn't clearly willing to support military action on Syria, would be an important step. And of course, as the Romans said, if you want peace, prepare for war. And so I think if the Supreme Leader sees us taking those steps, sees that we're serious about going down this road, it might be more likely that he's willing to make tough decisions and give up parts of his nuclear program. So the Supreme Leader doesn't want to deal with us. He thinks of the United States as a great Satan. But if we can make it clear that his alternative is a deal with the great Satan or war with the great Satan, he might just choose to make a deal with the devil.
Third question. As I was reading your book, this question was going through my mind. all other things being equal, do you think conflict with Iran is inevitable? So if nothing changes, are we going to end up in another war in the Middle East?
So as I see it, there are really three possible outcomes. One, a diplomatic settlement. Two, acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran. Or three, some kind of military conflict. So I don't think military conflict is inevitable. That's too strong. But I do think of the three, it's, in my view, the most likely. So the diplomatic outcome is our preferred strategy. That's what the administration's been pursuing. That's what the Bush administration pursued. And so what are the chances of a comprehensive deal? If we could solve this diplomatically, that would be by far the best outcome. But we have to be realistic. President Obama himself has said the chance of a comprehensive deal is, quote, no better than 50-50. President Obama's former WMD czar, Gary Seymour, has put the odds at closer to 0. And some officials were expressing optimism in recent weeks, but we saw in Vienna last week that the two sides are still very far apart. And immediately after the negotiations, both sides were expressing pessimism and said that it's going to be hard to get a deal. So still a significant chance that we won't get a deal. And even if we get a deal, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. The deal the administration is pursuing would leave Iran with a 6-month breakout capability. So that means that if the Supreme Leader made the decision to dash to a nuclear weapons capability, even with this comprehensive deal in place, that it would only take them about 6 months to get to the point of no return. 6 months to the point where we could no longer physically stop them if we wanted to. So I think what a comprehensive deal means, I think in a way a comprehensive deal is misleading. It's really kind of an interim deal, step 2. It gets Iran a little bit further away from having a nuclear weapon, but not a lot. So at best, getting a comprehensive deal would mean that the international community would have to remain forever laser-focused on Iran to detect and respond to any potential cheating, any potential attempt to break out. At worst, I think this comprehensive deal could quickly unravel. I think it would be very tempting for Iran, after striking a comprehensive deal, to try to sneak out of the deal after the international pressure is lifted. They're only 6 months away. Could the international community really, after declaring an end to the Iranian nuclear crisis, declaring a comprehensive settlement, would the international community be able to bring pressure back to bear if Iran broke out? So in sum, I think it's unlikely that we get a deal, and that even if we get a deal, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So I think it's still more likely than not that this conflict ends, that this crisis ends somewhere other than at the negotiating table. So if that's the case, then we'll be back at some point to this what is worse question. If you take the administration at their word, some people do, some people don't, then acquiescing, simply giving up is not an option, and we will take military action. So I hope that we can solve it diplomatically, but I'm not optimistic, and if diplomacy fails, then I think force is our best option, and it's the stated position of the country.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Sir.
Is there a microphone?
I think microphones might be coming. Just ask a question, and if you then
I can
repeat
repeat, sure.
Diplomacy failed 100 years ago. It failed because of a lack of transparency and a lack of credibility on the balancer, the superpower of that time, Great Britain. Okay. I've recently spent 6 months in the Middle East. What measures would you advise for the restoration of our credibility? Mention, please, an aside that allows us to provide bunker-type earth-burrowing bombs to the Israelis. Mention, if you please, the volte-face from Saudi Arabia to Israel, where airspace might be used and air bases might be used. Over to you.
Could
Great.
you please introduce yourself, sir?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Dr. Michael Krause, a soldier no longer young.
Great. So for those, you spoke loudly, so thank you very much for that. But for those who didn't hear, the question was about credibility and what are the things that we can do to increase credibility. So I mentioned a few in my opening remarks, or maybe it was to an earlier question, that if this round of negotiations fail, I think we should set clear red lines, engage in more open outreach to our allies and partners about the military option, and that Congress could pass tougher remaining sanctions and pass an authorization for the use of military force. Specifically to some of the points you mentioned, are there things that we could do to increase Israel's military capability to conduct the strike? Many people see Israel as more willing to take military action than the United States. So if we could do things, but the problem is Israel doesn't have the capabilities that the United States has to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, especially the deeply hardened and buried facilities. So some have suggested that we should do things to increase Israel's capability. So the weapon that the United States has in its arsenal that could make short work of Iran's deeply buried nuclear facilities is the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-busting weapon that can penetrate 200 feet before exploding. Israel doesn't have that capability. And Israel at present doesn't even have the ability to carry a bomb that large. The United States would deliver it probably on the B-2, but possibly also on the B-52. Israel doesn't have a heavy strategic bomber like that. They have the American-provided F-15, F-16 fighter bombers. So it's something that the United States could do. The United States could provide the massive ordnance penetrator, sometimes abbreviated as the MOP, to Israel. But in order to make that effective, we'd also have to be willing to provide either B-2 or B-52 bombers, something that we haven't been willing to do in the past. And on the B-2 in part because it has the stealth technology and we want to keep that secret. So I see that as a possible option, but an unlikely one. Another thing I think we could do to increase Israel's capability to conduct a strike is Israel has the capability to get the above-ground facilities. It's really the hardened and buried facilities that are difficult. So I think one of the goals of the negotiations should be to make Iran's nuclear program more targetable if they were to try to break out of an agreement. So to get Iran to close the underground facilities, close Qom, the facility buried in the side of a mountain, and Natanz, the other enrichment facility, has two enrichment chambers. There's an underground enrichment chamber, but there's also a pilot facility above ground. So I think if we could, as part of the comprehensive deal, get Iran to do, if we're going to allow Iran to have enrichment, which is a whole other question, but if we're going to allow them to have enrichment, to confine the enrichment to that above ground facility, and that way if they were to ever try to cheat or break out, Israel would have the ability to quickly target it. I think that would be another thing that we could do to increase the credibility of some actor taking military action if Iran were to try to break out of an agreement. Thank you.
Hi, Devin Streeter with the Strategic Intelligence Society. I actually was just wondering if you could potentially comment on Iran's approach to reciprocity and how they would react to a potential U.S. strike. Mm-hmm. Specifically, if they, at a certain point, would have the capacity for a second strike capability, or would they just react conventionally? Just if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah. Second strike capability is usually used in terms of nuclear retaliation. So to be clear, the argument of the book is not that we should wait until Iran acquires nuclear weapons and then take military action. At that point, it's too late. So the argument of the book is that if Iran starts ramping up its nuclear capability and gets to the point where it nearly has one bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium that it could use to make its first nuclear weapon, that would be our red line. We would have to strike at that point. If we waited at that point, then it's too late. Then they would essentially have nuclear weapons, and it would be difficult to do anything about it. It's essentially the situation we're in with North Korea today. We don't know if North Korea has an arsenal. We don't know if it's how well its weapons work. We don't know if they're deliverable. But we know they have enough material for a dozen bombs or so. We don't know where it is. And so therefore we don't really have a good military option. So the key is acting in Iran before we get to that point, acting before they have at least one or a few bombs worth of material. That said, if we take action on Iran, Iran would certainly retaliate. And so that's why we should try to solve this diplomatically, if at all possible. There are real risks to taking military action, and I don't want to downplay those. On the other hand, I think some people exaggerate those risks. Some people say it would lead to World War III and broader war in the Middle East, and I think that's really hard to see. And so to answer that question, you have to first begin with looking at what Iran's capabilities are. So what could they do? And then look at the strategic thinking in Iran and Iran's supreme leader. What would Iran's supreme leader do? So first, in terms of capabilities, Iran doesn't have a conventional military to speak of. Rather, they've been investing in these asymmetric military capabilities. So they have ties to terrorist groups, they have a large stockpile of ballistic missiles, and they have this IRGC Navy and other capabilities they could use to wreak havoc in the Persian Gulf, attack and harass ships in the Persian Gulf, and if they wanted to, close the Strait of Hormuz, or attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz. So that's the worst case scenario. They could launch dozens or hundreds of ballistic missiles in the Middle East, sponsor terrorist attacks, and try to close the Strait of Hormuz. But then the second question to ask is, what would Iran's supreme leader do? So imagine you're Iran's supreme leader. You wake up one morning and your nuclear facilities are destroyed. But your primary goal is to protect the regime, protect the military, and your military is intact, your regime's intact, you're still in control of the country. So the supreme leader at that point would have his own strategic dilemma. On one hand, he'd want to strike back. He'd want to save face domestically, reestablish deterrence internationally. On the other hand, he wouldn't want to pick a full-scale war with the United States, the greatest superpower on earth and the one country on earth that could guarantee that his military is completely destroyed and that his regime comes to an end. So most Iranian military analysts who have looked at this have said that the supreme leader is almost certainly going to try for some kind of calibrated response, that he's going to try to strike back but not too hard. And so I think the United States could play on the supreme leader's fears, that if we got to this point, if we had to take military action, that we could make it very clear that we're only interested in destroying the nuclear facilities, that we're not going to invade and overthrow the regime, but that if the supreme leader strikes back too hard, if he closes the Strait of Hormuz, if he sponsors major terrorist attacks in the United States, then at that point we would be willing to escalate the conflict. And in that way, I think we could deter larger military retaliation from Iran. Now, the other way that this could get out of hand, that other people have said that this could become a broader regional war, is that if Iran retaliates against Israel, Israel retaliates against Iran, and it becomes a broader conflict in that way. So I think another part of well-executed strategy, if we get to this point, would be going to Israel beforehand and striking a deal, and essentially telling the Israelis that we're going to take care of Iran's nuclear program, what they see as an existential threat, but in exchange they have to be willing to absorb some level of Iranian retaliation without getting into the conflict. And I think that's a deal Israel would be willing to strike. We essentially struck a similar deal in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, where they agreed to keep the IDF on the sidelines as we went into Iraq into Kuwait to expel Saddam Hussein. And so one other thing, that's just kind of one segment, but one of the things I do in the book is talk about kind of a strategy for taking military action and what's the best way to get the maximum destruction of Iran's nuclear facilities while limiting the downside risk. So I think some of these ideas of keeping Israel on the sidelines, making it a limited strike, deterring a broader retaliation from the supreme leader are some of the things that we could do to limit the risks of taking action.
Cecilia Liu from PhD student at George Washington University. Thanks for such a wonderful book explanation. I'm just wondering that what is your definition of diplomatic failure? And do you see that diplomatic failure, like we are still on a diplomatic pace when it comes to North Korean nuclear issue, or it's failed?
Right. So the question is, I say that we should take action if diplomacy fails. What does it mean for diplomacy to fail? Has diplomacy failed in the North Korean case? We believe they have enough material for a dozen or so nuclear weapons, yet we're still negotiating. So I think we should pursue the diplomatic option in Iran to the bitter end, just because the alternatives of military action or a nuclear-armed Iran are so bad. So what is the bitter end? Well, to understand this point, maybe just do some kind of simple military analysis, is in order to build nuclear weapons, Iran would have to do three things. First, it would have to get enough material for a weapon, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. The route we're worried most about now is highly enriched uranium. Second, it would have to form it into a nuclear device. And third, it would have to have some ability to deliver that to an opponent. Ballistic missiles are the delivery vehicle that Iran's invested most of its attention to. So some people look at that and say, oh, well, we have years to solve the problem. But that longer timeline really doesn't matter, because all that matters really is the first stage. Because right now we can strike Iran's nuclear facilities to prevent them from producing the material. But once they produce the material, the game's over. They could move that anywhere. They could move it to, we wouldn't know where it is. They could move it beyond the reach of our best bunker-busting weapons. So at that point, our only option is praying that they don't build nuclear weapons, which is not a good option. We can't physically stop them anymore. So our real red line, if we want to keep the military option on the table, if we want to have the ability to physically prevent them from building nuclear weapons, our real red line must be the production of one bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium. If it gets beyond that point, it's too late. So I say that if diplomacy fails, the president should set clear red lines. And so I think those red lines should be, one, if Iran enriches to higher levels, because if they were to enrich close to 90%, which is what they would need to do to build nuclear weapons, that would be a telltale sign they were dashing toward a bomb. Second, if they kick out international inspectors. If they kicked out international inspectors, we'd lose our window into Iran's program. We'd have to assume that they were up to no good, have to assume that they were enriching to higher levels. So that would be a red line. And then the third possibility is that if negotiations break down, that Iran wouldn't dash immediately to a nuclear weapons capability, that it wouldn't immediately start enriching to higher levels, it wouldn't immediately kick out inspectors, but rather that it would return to the strategy it was pursuing last summer before Rouhani was elected. It would slowly build up its program, bring more centrifuges online, more advanced centrifuges online, increase its stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. So right now it's estimated, Secretary Kerry actually told a Senate panel a couple of weeks ago, that if the Supreme Leader made the decision today to dash to nuclear weapons capability, it would take him roughly 2 to 3 months. But what happens if they start slowly ramping up their program is that dash time would slowly start to shrink. And so at some point their dash time would be shorter than our response time, both our military response time and the political response time. It would take some time to build domestic support, some time to build international support for military action. So we would also have to stop red lines to prevent Iran from getting to that kind of undetectable breakout scenario. And so you could do that by also setting red lines on the numbers and types of centrifuges and stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. So that's when diplomacy fails. If Iran is getting to that undetectable breakout capability, or if it's enriching to higher levels, or if it kicks out international inspectors, those are all signs that diplomacy has failed, and we need to switch immediately to preparing for military action.
I'm rather surprised to hear you discuss the possibility of Israelis accepting a retaliatory position. Looking at what Kerry has done in the Middle East recently and the reaction of these Israelis to Kerry, what is the realistic gap between Obama's red line and Netanyahu's red line? Because we're talking about when diplomacy fails for the United States. What's the timeline for when Israel thinks diplomacy has failed?
Good question. So often when the topic of military action on Iran comes up, people think of the Israeli military option because Israel's talked longer and more loudly about that option than the United States. So for a long time, I think there was a real risk in 2012 or so that Israel would take military action. Because for a long time, Israel's leaders were talking about this domain of immunity. So they said Iran's nuclear program was entering a domain of immunity, that would be Israel's red line. And so what they meant by that is that Iran's nuclear program would be so advanced and so far underground that Israel's military option wouldn't be very good anymore. But what happened is that I think Iran's essentially in that domain of immunity now, especially when they opened that facility at Qom in 2012. This is the facility buried in the side of a mountain under 295 feet of rock. So that's a very difficult target for both Israel and the United States. The United States could destroy it with this massive ordnance penetrator. Israel almost certainly could not. It could potentially bomb exits, entrances, ventilation, things like that, to at least render it inoperable for a while, but it couldn't destroy it. So I think Israel's leaders understand that. They understand they're in the domain of immunity now. So if Israel were to take military action, they could destroy the above-ground facilities. They might be able to get this underground facility at Natanz, but maybe not. It's under, I think, 70 feet of earth and a few meters of reinforced concrete. And they certainly couldn't get the facility at Qom. So for that reason, Israel understands that the U.S. military option is much better. We just have more capabilities to inflict lasting damage on Iran's nuclear program. So I think Israel's preferred strategy is for the United States to solve this. That being said, if Iran is approaching these red lines that I've talked before, if it's clear that they're dashing to a nuclear capability, and it becomes clear to Israel that the United States was bluffing, that the United States isn't willing to take action, then at that point I think Israel will go ahead and take action. I don't think Israel would accept Iran building nuclear weapons. But the Israeli option is not nearly as good as the U.S. option. Best estimates are that an Israeli attack would buy us a couple of years, a U.S. strike I mean, all these estimates are difficult because they depend on things you simply can't know. Does Iran decide to rebuild? How quickly does it decide to rebuild? Is it able to access materials on the international market that it still needs? Are there other political or geopolitical conflicts that makes the program difficult to sustain? But kind of worst case scenario, if Iran rebuilds immediately and doesn't encounter any significant problems, best estimates are an Israeli strike buys us a couple of years, a U.S. strike buys us 3, 5, 7, something like that. So if it gets to that point, I think that's why it should be a U.S. strike, not an Israeli strike. There are going to be many downside risks in either case, so we might as well get the benefit of actually setting back the program significantly.
We have a question from one of our online viewers, Michael Bashor, intern at the Center for Science, Technology, and Security Policy. Why don't we have any direct lines of communication with Iran when we had direct communication with the Soviet Union? How do we avoid misunderstandings? And what's the likelihood that Iran will be able to pursue its nuclear weapons program undetected?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've always had, even though we haven't had formal diplomatic relations with Iran, we have had different back channels over the years where we could make sure that important messages were getting through. And the channels of communication have increased in recent months with the election of President Rouhani. So you had President Obama and President Rouhani speaking on the phone this fall, first direct communication between leaders of these two countries in a long time. And of course, in the negotiations, in these P5+1 negotiations, you have representatives from the United States, from the other members of the UN Security Council, the permanent members, Germany and Iran meeting. So we just had negotiations last week. They're going to return to negotiations in Vienna on June 16th. And as has been widely reported, the United States negotiators and the Iranian negotiators have been meeting in bilateral meetings in these international negotiations, so direct U.S.-Iranian negotiations. So now there is, I think, quite a bit of communication. And the second question was on... Oh, yeah. So an important question, of course, is unknown facilities. So all these things that I've been talking about before, the facilities that we'd want to shut down as part of a diplomatic deal, the facilities that we'd have to destroy and as part of a strike, Iran's dash time to nuclear weapons, all of these things assume that we have a good sense of what Iran's nuclear program looks like. But there's, of course, always the possibility that there are things that we don't know about. What if Iran has unknown facilities? And so that's a real concern. Many people would point out, of course, if you look at the history of nuclear diplomacy, that often our intelligence agencies were wrong about nuclear programs in other countries, that we were surprised at how quickly the Soviet Union developed its nuclear capability. We thought that Saddam Hussein was further along than he was in 2003, so we've been wrong in the past. How do we know we're not wrong in Iran? So it's an important question. I think there's good reason to believe that we do know the full extent of Iran's program, however, and I go through in the book and explain why that is. But part of the reason is just that we have such a good IAEA presence on the ground in Iran. So some of these cases historically, the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, we didn't have a good IAEA presence on the ground. But as part of the interim deal negotiated in November, we have International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors at Iran's key nuclear facilities, including daily visits to some of the most important sites. So that gives us a very good window on the program. And Iran has tried to build secret facilities in the past. The facility at Natanz and Iraq were meant to be secret facilities, and we uncovered them in 2002. The facility at Qom was meant to be a secret facility. We uncovered it in 2009. So Iran hasn't been very good at hiding these facilities in the past. Also, Iran doesn't have unlimited capabilities, and these facilities are expensive. So to believe that Iran has an enrichment facility up and running that we don't know about it, we'd have to assume that Iran was building multiple secret facilities in parallel, and that we've only uncovered some of them. And I think that borders on implausibility, and I go through some of the reasons why that's the case in the book. So, of course, you don't know what you don't know, but I think there is very good reason to believe that we know the full extent of Iran's program. But it's, as we pursue diplomacy, it's part of the reason that having a good inspection presence on the ground is important. You know, as Reagan said, trust but verify.
Thank you, Kjell Engelbrecht, visiting fellow to Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Great talk, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. Could you elaborate on the tougher sanctions that you mentioned and the congressional authorization of a military strike, what would they entail, and is there a relevant precedent for the latter?
So first, in terms of sanctions, you may recall after the interim deal was struck in November, Congress was writing up a bill that had pretty strong bipartisan support that would lay out the tougher remaining sanctions that the United States would pass if Iran cheated on the interim deal, or if we failed to get a comprehensive deal by this July 20th deadline. It's kind of arbitrary deadline that the two sides have imposed on themselves. And so that's exactly what I have in mind, those remaining, because the sanctions regime is very strong, but there are some remaining things we could do in the banking sector and in the oil sector that would, again, increase even more the economic pressure on Iran. The authorization for the use of military force, there is precedent for this. So Congress authorized the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. So something similar. Of course, according to the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war. The President also has the ability to use force abroad for 90 days before seeking a congressional authorization. So the President could potentially use that authority to take military action against Iran. But I think any president would prefer to have broad political support going in. And so I think the administration would prefer to have that support, and I think it would send a stronger message internationally to have the U.S. Congress behind the president. And I think Congress would be willing to support such an authorization. There has been talk about introducing such a bill in the past, and Congress has always been more forward-leaning on Iran than the administration. We've seen that all along with the sanctions regime. Congress was trying to push tougher sanctions. The administration tried to dissuade them from doing so. The sanctions went into effect, they were effective, and then the administration claimed credit. But I think given that pattern that Congress has been more forward-leaning on Iran, and that Congress is more concerned about Iran's nuclear program than it was in, say, Syria and the Syrian use of chemical weapons, I do think that there would be political support for an authorization of that nature. Yes?
The predication of many of the things that you've said are about this rush to completion of capability. Let's say that happens, and they have completed the rush like 1945 we did. We were out of bombs, and nobody knew it. What do you think would be the most likely use of that achieved capability once they woke up in one beautiful day and he said, "I've got it, it's on the shelf"? But he's probably only got one at that point. Mm-hmm. What's he going to do? Just put up a flag and say, "I got it"? No.
So the question is, what would Iran do once it gets the first nuclear weapon? And so I touched on this a little bit in my response to Michaela about how Iran would use nuclear weapons politically. But I think they would declare the capability that they're a nuclear power now, that they're immune to foreign attack. And I think that they would be right in that estimation. Even if they only had one nuclear weapon, the United States, of course, would still have vast conventional superiority, vast nuclear superiority. But at that point, there's a risk that if we were to try to take some kind of military action against Iran to disarm them of that one weapon, that we would miss it, or that they would be able to use it against Israel or against U.S. bases or forces in the region. So I think any U.S. leader would have to be very cautious in that situation, that taking any kind of action against Iran potentially risks a nuclear attack. So I think that they would announce that capability to have that deterrence in place. I think it would be very unlikely that anyone would take strong action to try to stop them at that point, and then slowly build up their arsenal. So some people say, well, why are we worried about Iran? Have a couple of weapons. Is that really that big of a threat? But I don't think there's any reason to believe that Iran would stop with a couple of weapons. If it really wants to be the most dominant state in the Middle East, I think over time it would like to have a larger, more robust arsenal. So I see Pakistan as more the model of what Iran would eventually want, rather than something like what North Korea has. Eventually I think Iran would like to have, if it could get there, hundreds of weapons, mobile missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're close to having ICBMs already. So I don't think that Iran's just aiming to have, some people say, well, maybe they just want a nuclear weapons option. They just want a latent nuclear capability. Maybe they want to get really close to having nuclear weapons, but stop just short. But I don't think that really makes any sense. If you just look at what Iran's stated goals are, again, to become the most dominant power in the Middle East, having a nuclear arsenal helps you to do that. It helps you deter foreign attack. It makes you only one of 10 states on Earth with nuclear weapons. Having an advanced nuclear capability, having the Japan option, as some people call it, doesn't do any of those things. You can't threaten to retaliate against other countries by having an advanced civilian nuclear capability. Having an advanced civilian nuclear capability, a technology that's 70 years old at this point, doesn't make you a leading world power. It doesn't make you the most dominant state in the region. It doesn't make Japan the most dominant state in East Asia. So I think we're fooling ourselves if we think Iran's going to get close and then voluntarily stop short. I think it would like to have a robust nuclear posture that would help it to become the most dominant state in the region.
Hi, thanks. Hunter Eustis with the Air Force. Thanks, Matt. I haven't read your book yet. I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about your vision of the day after a successful U.S. strike that set the program back maybe 5 years out. What would the impact be on how would North Korea act, and would it require a continued military presence in the Middle East and intrusive military follow-on strikes or intelligence reconnaissance flights, things like that?
Yeah. How North Korea would act, that's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought of that. In terms of what would happen in the region, and so as I talked about before, I think Iran would almost certainly retaliate, and I think we would have to have a strategy in place for dealing with that retaliation. And that's one other reason why I think a U.S. strike is preferable to an Israeli strike alone. The United States just has more capabilities, both diplomatic and military, to deal with any fallout and deal with the retaliation. The purpose of a strike, of course, wouldn't be just to buy those 3 to 5 years. The hope would be that in that time that you create time and space to get to a non-nuclear outcome, that would create time and space for other things to happen where Iran ends up permanently, or at least in a politically meaningful time frame without nuclear weapons. So some people argue, well, if we take military action, Iran is just going to double down and quickly rebuild nuclear weapons. It's actually going to bring about the result we're trying to prevent. So one of the things I do in the book is actually go through the history of preventive strikes on nuclear facilities in the past. So there have been 4 countries that have had their nuclear facilities attacked in the past. Nazi Germany during World War II, Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, and then subsequently Israel followed up with a strike, and then the U.S. and an international coalition followed up with subsequent strikes. Iran had its nuclear facilities bombed in the Iran-Iraq War by Saddam Hussein, so they've been through this before. And Syria had a nuclear reactor bombed in 2007 by Israel. So in all of those cases, the countries taking military action thought they were only buying a few months or a few years, but in every case, politics and geopolitics happened. Something completely unforeseen at the time happened that prevented that country from building nuclear weapons. So Nazi Germany lost World War II. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which led to this big international coalition putting it into his program. Iran decided to rebuild its nuclear capabilities, but here we are 30 years later and it still doesn't have a weapon. And then in Syria, a civil war, completely unforeseen, engulfs the country and prevents Assad from pursuing his nuclear capability. So the purpose of a strike wouldn't be just to get those 3 years, but to buy the time and space for other things to intervene to contribute to a non-nuclear outcome. So these people who say that Iran will simply rebuild nuclear weapons immediately, I guess it's possible, but historically that's never happened. So I think the burden is really on them to explain exactly how that would work. Because I don't see how that would work. Their nuclear capabilities have just been destroyed. We took what was a dash to a nuclear weapons capability and turned it into a marathon. So I think there are a lot of reasons to believe that would prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, at least for a politically meaningful time frame.
All right. Dr. Kronick will be staying after the event here if you want to have your book signed. And thank you so much for coming, Dr. Kronick.
Pleasure.